So welcome everybody for this third edition of this IIT Gandhinagar program, History of Ideas. So this program is a little bit different from a general popular science talk. The idea of this program is to also understand the historical evolution of important scientific ideas. So we are very happy and grateful to the speakers who have agreed to give seminar and spend their important time with us. So today we have two very interesting talks. The first talk is by Professor Rhitoban, who is a faculty at ISAR Mohali. And the second talk is by Professor Leslie Lazar, who is also a faculty at IIT Gandhinagar. So let us start with the first talk without spending any much time. So Rhitoban, all yours.
Thanks, Udita. Welcome everyone. I'm a little apprehensive to begin with. I've never given a biology talk to more or less non-biological audience. I hope you'll find your time here is worth it. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you all on a Saturday afternoon where you could have been spending in a far more productive ways, but there you go. Okay, so what I will do is I will give you a brief introduction of what I am going to say. I'll begin by giving you a very brief introduction. What is actually meant by evolution by natural selection? I will then try to give you a brief historical background and the context of this evolution of the theory. And then I'll talk about Darwin and Wallace's synthesis of these ideas so that we can understand the theory of natural selection proper. And then I'm going to do a cherry picking of the implications of this particular theory as we find it today, right? It turns out that this theory has profound implications in biology, and obviously we will not have time to go into each and every one of them. So I've cherry picked, and this is exclusively due to me. This is what I find interesting. Okay. Now, to begin at the very beginning, let me clarify with the fact that what is the goal of biology, right? In a way, it tries to understand life around us, right? However, there are some practical aspects to it, which is essentially to understand, describe, and manipulate the manifestation of the living world around us. And to do that, we have to understand life across all of its levels of organization. And in very simple words, the goal of biology is to understand why is life the way it is. As it turns out, life does not exist in a continuum. The variation is clusters into units called species. And it is within the very different number of species that the manifestation of this diversity of life takes place. Okay. Now, before Darwin, what was the major views on how variation in life is produced? Primarily, it was the biblical view of divine creation, where species do not change, lineages do not split. Each species has been independently and separately created at the time of creation, and Earth and life are very young. In fact, someone figured out that the life of Earth must be close to just 7,000 years. Okay. However, the major theories explaining these kinds of explanations were obviously creationism, biological similarities, differences, everything originated at creation. However, it was also the time when fossils were being discovered. They had discovered the fossil of pterosaurs, Archaeopteryx, so that creationist view needed to be updated. And it was essentially done with catastrophism, where biblical floods were assumed to be cyclical in nature, and each and every layer of geological strata that they had sort of was the result of different floods throughout the history of life. At the same time, there was a growing clamor from scientists who basically sort of said, look, that is not true. Species are changing, species are evolving, and one kind of species is giving rise to another. And therefore, diversity of life is increasing. Okay. The Darwin and Wallace's view of biological diversity can be summed up, therefore, in very few sentences. What is it in its essence? It is descent with modification. That modification manifests itself into different populations of the same species. That's known as microevolution. Over time, these changes become different enough, the populations of the same species become different enough, becomes different species. That means lineage is split and diverse, giving rise to different species by the process of speciation. If this process is allowed to continue for great lengths of time, these can eventually give rise to newer life forms, which is known as macroevolution. The corollary to this view is, therefore, all life forms are related. And therefore, one of the implications of this is Earth and life here on Earth are much, much older than prescribed by biblical views. That, in a nutshell, is evolution by natural selection. So what is important to understand that no theory exists in a vacuum. During the time of Darwin, and sometimes even before it, there was a general consensus among scientists that life had been on Earth for a very long time. It was also the foundation of the major branches of science like geology. Continental drift had sort of been identified and sort of been hinted at. Therefore, what we can sort of surmise from these is that it had changed over time. And therefore, many species had become extinct. If species had become extinct, then we have to explain, in spite of that, why do we see relatively new species? So they are also being born at the same time, right? This was sort of emerging as a consensus, but the problem with this view was that there was no mechanism to understand this dynamic view of life, right? As I said, it's a brief timeline of the major events that happened during that time. What I would like to emphasize that Darwin was influenced by the works of Charles Lyell, especially his book Principles of Geology, where he was first explaining that the Earth had many different strata across many, many millions of years. Also, he read books of Charles Malthus, who basically said that the growth of human individuals essentially occurs in a geometric fashion, whereas the growth of the food or the sustenance necessary to maintain that number of individuals happens very slowly, almost in an arithmetic manner. Now, to account for these disparities, what eventually happens, there are major losses of human lives when this sustenance breaks down. It means, in a way, there is some struggle for existence. All individuals who are born do not survive to adulthood. Okay, so these were the general views on the time when Darwin was trying to establish his theories. So essentially, what was the synthesis of Darwin and Wallace? First, as was demonstrated by Charles Lyell and others, and Darwin was a trained geologist, Earth's history stretches back millions of years. Right? It is not the 6,000 years as prescribed. Species are mutable and are subject to change. Here, I must emphasize that these ideas were not evolving in isolation in Darwin and Wallace's minds. Curiously enough, Darwin's own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was one of the first to say that species mutate, there is transmutation of species. And therefore, the confirmation came from the evidence of the newly discovered fossil species that were coming up and around that time. The major striking features of that, fossils who are obviously dead and extinct looked very similar to species that were living. Therefore, they must have changed. Now, this change in species is also very easy to determine through the artificial selection that humans have done for millennia. They have devised many, many different varieties of plants and animals for their own benefit. So therefore, species can obviously change, and humans have been doing it for quite some time, right? Also, because of Darwin's voyages around the world, and I'll explain it a little later, variations can manifest itself when populations are isolated from parental species, like example famously made famous by the Darwin's finches of the Galapagos Islands. Now, global and local environment change continues. We know that logical history that was slowly becoming evident at that time. Therefore, life must adapt to this changing environment. Individual organisms are born with subtle variations. This was common knowledge. We could see them in the animals and plants that they raised. Organisms' characteristics are inherited by their offspring. Also common knowledge, very, very clearly seen by plant and animal breeders. From the Malthusian view, it was also apparent that life is a struggle for survival. Therefore, the logical conclusion of all these facts are that variations that help these organisms to survive and adapt are passed on, and eventually new species evolve through natural selection. That, in a nutshell, is evolution by natural selection. Also, during Darwin's voyage, as he collected different specimens from across the world, specifically Galapagos Islands, they could basically surmise how species have changed. This is through the process of adaptive radiation. In those tiny islands, these finches, which arrived from mainland South America, diversified into many, many different forms. Species vary morphologically in conspicuous ways. They also occupy a diversity of ecological niche. Essentially, the major selective pressure on these birds have been the nature of the food that is available in these islands, which are essentially mostly seeds of these different plants. And based on which seeds they have adapted to, their beak shape have changed. What is also becoming very clear is that once Darwin brought these specimens back to London, he, by the way, did not realize that these were all finch species. He had to take the help of his friend who was, I think it was Jay Gould, who was much better at making the discovery that these are essentially all species of finches. That means in a tiny bit of an island in the middle of nowhere, if such processes can produce this amount of diversity in a very tiny lineage of birds, given the amount of space on the surface of the earth and the time and the age of the earth, these very simple natural processes can also explain the diversity that we see around. Okay. So I'll give you a very brief context of the historical significance of these discoveries. Primarily because, hey, are the slides changing? I'm sorry, somebody just told me the slides are not changing.
No, it was the Impetus till now, the colonial
Oh,
exploration.
good. Okay, it is. So you can see the Britannia rules the waves picture, right?
Yeah, till now.
Good. Let me know if the slides do not change. Okay. So no theory in science or in sociology can exist in a vacuum. It needs a impetus, right? Because science, like most things, is also human activity. Therefore, we have to understand the context under which a need of such theory evolves, right? And this is somewhat due to the fact that the 18th and the 19th century were the high noon of colonial exploration. The Europeans traveled across the world for whatever reasons and tried to expand their dominion over the other people. This was possible made possible by better navigation system. So the maritime journeys became less dangerous, so much so that all the interest of the common public suddenly turned to the riches that the colonies of these European powers had to offer. And the British Museum was founded, the Natural History Museum was founded to showcase these things, right? So what was very clear by that time that the Columbian exchange had already established itself, which is essentially the discovery of the new world and the exchange of the major flora and fauna, the old world and the new world. Now, the importance of this cannot be overestimated. If you can imagine Indian food without chilies, potatoes, and tomatoes, then you can probably understand the importance of this Columbian exchange, because all three ingredients come from South America. We also gave them other stuff, lots of diseases, smallpox, measles, so on and so forth, which eventually resulted in decimation of South American native people. Anyways, the invention of the Wardian case made shipment of plants across continents easier. It was the discovery that if you seal in a glass container plants and seeds, they survive better across its transoceanic journeys. That's how John Fortune stole seeds of tea plant from China, brought it first to India, to the botanical gardens in Calcutta, then to Shimla, so on and so forth, and spread it across the world. This Columbian exchange made commodities like spices, rubber, tea, coffee, sugar, daily household necessities. Therefore, there was a huge economic reason why such transoceanic voyages were necessary, right? It was money, after all, okay, that made these voyages possible. And because of these voyages, specimens from all across the empire poured into Britain. Therefore, studying natural history or trying to become a naturalist became a major and profitable profession. And one such young aspirant was Charles Darwin. He had tried to become a doctor, fainted at the sight of blood. Then his father forced him to become a theologian, which he absolutely hated. And at that time, when he was barely 22 years old, he came across an opportunity to go to a circumnavigating expedition in HMS Beagle. And his own intention was just not exploration. He wanted to establish himself as a major player in the scientific circles through natural history. However, to establish oneself, you need, just like we do today, publications. And to do those publications, you need to do experiments, right? Darwin's own experiments and publications came from his voyage around the world in HMS Beagle. The primary reason of why Beagle was commissioned was to map the South American coast so that it becomes progressively easier to of other forthcoming visits. When Darwin returned, he wrote an account of his travels in a travelogue, The Voyage of the Beagle. It became an instant bestseller. Right? It is still eminently readable even today. It went through many, many different editions. Darwin became a household name. His work slowly started to appear, his naturalistic work, across many, many different societies and journals. Most importantly, Darwin was a name that people of power and influence came to recognize. He achieved name recognition through his publication of a travelogue. Okay, and in the meantime, Darwin settled down, married his cousin. His family was rich enough, never had to worry about money to do his experiments. But he realized the importance of his theories, and he did not publish on it for many, many years. Primarily, he was extremely shy and abhorred confrontation. Also, he realized that publication of his natural selection book would hurt the religious sentiments of his own wife, with whom he was in love. Right? It's actually pretty rare in those days. Okay. Now, here I want to digress for a little bit and talk about Wallace. Wallace often seems to be sidelined by Darwin, and he shouldn't be. One of the reasons why that happens is because of the spectrum of the society from which they came from. Darwin was a gentleman. His name recognition was through his family. He married through the family of Josiah Wedgwood, the owner of Wedgwood Potteries, a major industrial enterprise. His grandfather was famous, or to the point of being infamous, and he was one of the people of establishment. Wallace was just the opposite. He had to bring in money to do his own research through selling different skins and different specimens to the many, many museums that had now sprung up and had an insatiable appetite for specimens. So Wallace also traveled the world, but in much less salubrious conditions. Many times he lost his entire collection because he could not hire boats big enough to have a safe journey. Once in Malaya, he was afflicted with malaria, and in his fevered delirium, he came up with the theory of natural selection. He wrote it up, and whom did he send it to? Remember, I told you that Darwin had now become a household name. Wallace sent the paper to Darwin. Darwin was still sitting on his book. Once he received the letter from Wallace, he was terrified. But to his good graces, he put it on a paper for the Royal Society and put both his and Wallace's name. So in a way, the theory of natural selection should be Darwin and Wallace's theory of natural selection. Anyways, so what is therefore the implication and importance of the theory of natural selection? Right. First and foremost, the diversity around us does not need a divine explanation. Processes that can produce different breeds of pigeons, dogs, flowers that human beings have been developing for thousands of years through artificial selection. The same process can also produce these observed variation in nature, but through natural selection. Changes within one lineage of organism can give rise to another different lineage. Every living thing, therefore, is related to one another. And by this time, it has been established that the Earth is certainly old enough to produce this variation through natural selection. And this emphasis cannot be overestimated. The reason is we often forget that we are also part of this Earth. Although we dominate it like no other species, we are also the products of this process which produces every other living thing. And therefore, it has often been said, and I quote here Daniel Dennett, who remains one of the most important philosophers of science today. If I were to give a prize for the single best idea anybody ever had, I'd give it to Darwin and for the idea of natural selection. And the reason why he thinks this is important is because it unites two most disparate features of this universe. The world of purposeless, meaningless matter in motion on one side, and the world of meaning and design on the other. Darwin did understand what he was proposing was a truly revolutionary idea. Okay, so much so that this has now become the paradigm in biology. And Theodosius Dobzhansky, who was one of the most important geneticists of his time, is famous for quoting that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Okay, so what I'll now do is try to cherry pick some of the things that Darwin explained or could not explain in his books, which later became major lines of inquiry. And primarily among them was genetics. Darwin could not propose a mechanism by which this variation is carried forward through generations. It did not have a clue of how inheritance happens. Right? His idea of genetics was flawed. It was blending inheritance. You take a red flower and a white flower, breed them, you'll get pink flowers. What this essentially means is that if the red color is new, that gets lost. So the variation which Darwin was claiming, who is slowly being selected by nature through his own ideas of genetics, would therefore go away from a population. Okay, and this more or less very similar time was also proposed by Gregor Mendel, who was a monk. He proposed through his breeding experiments of bees the basic particulate nature of genes. He, after publishing his theories, Gregor Mendel became the chief monk of his monastery. Essentially, he became a bureaucrat. He stopped doing science because he didn't have enough time. And people also forget his own work. Later, these were discovered by Karl Lorenz, Hugo de Vries, and Eric von Teschemark. And they said, well, that's not how Darwinian evolution works. It works through Mendelian principles of particulate nature. It took another 20 years to figure out that what they were talking about as different phenomena is essentially the same coin, two sides of the same coin. And therefore, this gave rise to the entire field of genetics and later genomics as we find today. What is the goal of these two different areas in biology? They are to find variation. That is the major goal. Once you've found variation, then you can do many, many different things, right? This began through the work of Darwin, and through the, and I must say here that through the inability of Darwin to explain the reason, the cause of inheritance. Okay. Curiously enough, when Darwin published his book on the theory of natural selection, the origin of species, there is very little explanation on how new species are produced, right? He did not explain anywhere through his major book, how do you have speciation, right? And here is the major problem. species are generally reproductively isolated from each other, although they do not have to. But let's take the simplest example. That essentially means that hybrids between those two good species are either dead, that means they're inviable, or sterile. That means the hybrids are unfit. They cannot reproduce on their own. Either they will have major physiological and genetic problems, or they will simply be dead, right? And that's how you maintain the uniqueness of two species. Because these two species cannot breed, they cannot exchange genes. But how can natural selection produce unfit individuals, right? Natural selection is a process by which you can get fitter and fitter individuals through time. So therefore, what is the role of natural selection in producing species, right? Darwin did not know. And again, we had to depend on Theodosius Dobzhansky and Hermann Muller about how you can establish incompatibilities or hybrid inviability and hybrid sterility in different species. And the idea is very, very simple. And this is the cartoon which explains it. If you imagine a population with the genotypes capital A, capital B, capital B, these populations then get isolated and they start evolving on their own. Since the process of change is almost continuous, the capital A evolves into small a in one population and the capital B allele evolves into small b in another. Now, over time, this becomes homozygous. And when these two species come together, they produce incompatibility simply because in the background of capital A and capital B, small a and small b are mutually incompatible because they have not evolved with these mutations. As the small a, small b interaction is not present in the pure species, the evolution of incompatibility is possible. We have now plenty of examples of this. This has been one of the major theoretical and conceptual foundations of the last 100 years. Darwin obviously did not have an idea of how this happens. Okay. Also, Darwin was the first person to think in terms of interrelationships amongst the different species. And there's a famous page from his notebook where he makes a doodle. If you have species A, B, C, and D, he draws a tree-like diagram trying to explain the relationship between these species. And very poignantly, he writes, "I think." And in a letter to one of his friends, Huxley, Darwin writes, "The time will come, I believe, though I shall not live to see it, when we shall have fairly true genealogical, essentially phylogenetic, trees of each great kingdom of nature. Unfortunately, we still have not reached that. We still don't know how many species there are on Earth, and we can only speculate. And this has become a major thrust area in biology, especially when we're dealing with species loss and climate change. Darwin's own work was also the beginning of the research on animal behavior. As I mentioned before, specimens were pouring in from all parts of the globe into shores of England, and a chimpanzee, the name of Jenny, arrived in London Zoo, and it caused a sensation. People lined up for hours just to have a glimpse of the first chimpanzee, to arrive in the shores of England. Among them was Darwin. And this orangutan was named Jenny. It received major coverage in most of the newspapers. And Darwin went into the cage with Jenny. Remember, by this time, he had already become a household name, an eminent scientist, right? So, the modern study of animal behavior started with Darwin and his book on the origin of species. The subsequent books, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, and Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals, laid the foundations of animal behavior research. When the first orangutan arrived in London Zoo in 1837, it was nicknamed Jenny. You went inside the cage of Jenny for detailed observations on her behavior and how it reflects on our own behavior, right? He was one of the first to have done a comparative analysis of the two apes that he had access to, humans and orangutans. Most importantly, Darwin compared her reactions to those of a human child, his own infant son. The experience reinforced Darwin's view that man was descended from animals. He wrote in his notebook that after meeting an animal like Jenny, no man could boast of his proud preeminence. Right? Also, curiously enough, it was Darwin who had suggested, given all the evidence that he had found so far, that humans evolved in Africa. He was the first scientist to have, a first major scientist to say this. Now, this was a major deviation from the accepted norms of even the scientific people. Scientific racism was involved. Many of the people in African or Asian origin were not even considered human beings, right? And for Darwin to say this, that we have evolved in Africa and our closest relatives are Africans, was a major revolutionary point made in the times that he lived. Another problem that Darwin had, that he could not explain altruism, right? Altruism refers to an individual acting in a way that would decrease its own survival chances, right? But improve the survival chances of another individual. It was a major obstacle for Darwin, who could not explain the evolution of altruism through natural selection. I'll explain what altruism is in the next slide. So again, in a letter and in a chapter 2, one of his book of Origin of Species went through many editions in his own lifetime. When he writes there, I confine myself with one special difficulty, which at first appearance to me is insuperable and is actually fatal to my whole theory. It's a huge problem. It can turn his theory upside down. I allude to the neuters of sterile females in insect communities. For these neuters often differ widely in instinct and in structure from both the males and fertile females. And yet, from being sterile, they cannot propagate their own kind. So what is essentially Darwin talking about? These insect colonies have castes which are sterile. That essentially means that they do not reproduce, but help the queen and the king in some cases to do so. This was fatal to Darwin's theory of natural selection, right? How can altruism evolve? If the recipient of the altruistic act benefits, then it is going to leave more offspring, right? The actor, the altruist, on the contrary, is going to leave fewer or no offspring. So there will be progressively fewer altruists in the coming generations and the trait would disappear. But there are lots of examples of apparent altruism in nature. Many members of the eusocial insects, bees, termites, ants, do not reproduce. Instead, they act as helpers at parents' nest for their entire life. Darwin knew this, and he could not explain it. Therefore, sterility and obligate helping is an extreme type of altruism. You are not reproducing yourself, but helping others to reproduce. It also shows suicidal behavior. It's very common. Honeybees, once they sting, they die. there are species of ants which are grenade soldiers that burst their abdomen gland and spray glue on enemies. But eventually they are all dead. Why are they sacrificing themselves for somebody else's reproduction? Darwin could not explain this. Now we know. Well, we have an explanation. Still don't know a lot of it. It is because of haplodiploidy in major class of these social insects. Wasps, bees, and ants are haplodiploids. That essentially means they are females are diploid and males are haploid. Males come from unfertilized eggs of mothers. Therefore, in this particular group of insects, males do not have a father. Okay, so therefore, since the males are haploid, there is no reduction division, there is no meiosis. Whatever genome a male has to go to the next generation. Once it fertilizes with eggs, they become diploid zygotes, which are all females, right? So daughters receive all of their father's genes and have their mother's genes. So the daughters share 3/4 of their genes. Between two sisters, genetic relatedness is 3/4. Sisters are highly related to each other and have haplodiploid. Now let's assume what would be the genetic relatedness if any one of these females, instead of helping others, started to reproduce themselves. Females would be related to their offspring through just half, because remember, they share half of their genome or genes, but they're related to 3/4 with their own sisters. Therefore, they are more related to their sisters than they are to their own offspring. A very, very curious form of reproduction in nature. This suggests females would be better off if they favored the production of reproductive sisters rather than their own offspring. Okay, this is famously summed up by the equation in Hamilton's rule, which was again a major explanation of the things that Darwin could not figure out. Hamilton's rule can explain the evolution of altruism. Now, I'll end this talk by talking about probably the greatest contribution of Darwin, which is not natural selection. Anyways, when we observe variation in nature, we see a very curious phenomenon. We often see that the two sexes, wherever they are sexes, almost invariably look different. Right? Here are two examples of very famous birds of paradise. Right? And this is not a very facetious comment. Right? Sexual dimorphism is very, very difficult to identify. So much so that very, very recently, this is last year, for nearly 100 years, the same species, males and females, were classified as separate species. Female was classified as a leaf insect and a male as a stick insect. This is extreme sexual dimorphism. Right? So in Darwin's second major book, On the Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, Darwin sought out a theory to explain why do we see such sexual dimorphism. He needed a theory to explain the many extravagant traits that seem to reduce the survival, right? The peacock's tail, right? So why do sexual dimorphism exist? Why does one sex is often larger, showier, while the others are smaller and very drab to look at least to us? Right? Interestingly, many of the traits seen in these showier sex seem likely to reduce the prospects of survival. You can see a male peacock if you are a predator because of its tail. Therefore, evolution by natural selection cannot explain these different traits. Darwin came up with a very, very pithy explanation. This is because differential reproductive success due to variation among individuals in success as getting mates. Or in other words, else being equal, since males produce huge number of gametes which are cheap, any male trait that confers mating and fertilization advantages is passed down across generations and over time will increase in frequency in a population, because males with such traits produce more offspring than their competitors. This has nothing to do with the good of the species or good of the individual. Any trait that makes a male leave more offspring will spread through the population, right? It doesn't have to be good or a more fit for the entire species. Now, Darwin's idea about the struggle among males for mating opportunities forms one basic foundation of our current understanding of sexual selection. Males should be competitive with other males. Females should be choosy in the males they select. Okay. Now, here I want to point out that this is not a general statement. Maleness and femaleness are very different in the context of sexual selection than what we assume in normal life, right? These differences are not inherent to maleness and femaleness, so much so as they are dictated by survival and fitness. And examples exist, as always does in biology, of exceptions where females are the more aggressive sex. Okay, so to sum up why many scientists think that sexual selection is one of the most original contributions of Darwin, I just wanted to remind you guys that natural selection theory had its predecessors, including Darwin's own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, as well as other scientists who focused on the same explanation, just like Alfred Russel Wallace. However, sexual selection theory seems to have been birthed purely by Darwin, without historical precedents and also without contemporary support. Sexual selection theory is almost purely Darwinian. Therefore, this theory remains one of the greatest contributions of Darwin to science. And I will end my talk over here. Thank you for spending this time over here.